Good morning and welcome to our webinar this morning, the subject of which is ISO 45001-2018. We'll be providing an overview of this particular standard, as well as talking about the migration process for currently certified clients and introducing some of the main changes with the standard, which can be helpful for clients who are not yet certified, as well as currently certified clients who will be making the transition to this new standard. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I'll be conducting today's webinar. I have an overview of the agenda on the screen, give you an idea of what we'll be covering this morning over the course of the next hour. We'll save time for questions at the end. You can type them into the question field in the webinar toolbar at any point that you think of them. And like I said, we'll revisit those at the end of the presentation. For those of you who are not familiar with PGR, we are one of the world's leading registrars. We have certified companies in a variety of countries around the world and are accredited to grant certification to a variety of standards. I'm not sure that this is even an all-inclusive list, but it certainly gives you an idea of the variety of standards that we audit to. I'm just going to go back one slide really quick and discuss. So OSAS 18001 2007 is the health and safety standard on which ISO 45001 is based. So some clients are already certified to that particular standard. In the interim of conducting audits to the new standard, if we conduct those audits or have conducted those audits prior to obtaining accreditation, which is a lengthy process, we can grant unaccredited certifications, or we'll hold off on issuing the certificates until accreditation is obtained, but we can go ahead and already be conducting audits to the standard, just to clarify the statement on this particular slide. So at a high level, there are a variety of benefits to getting certified to a standard such as ISO 45001. The structure of the various standards assists clients in meeting their legal requirements that they're subject to. A health and safety standard like this one improves the organization's health and safety performance by going through the process of implementing the standard's requirements, providing a safe environment to do business for employees, visitors, anyone who may be in the facility or near the facility would benefit from a safer environment. Management commitment and employee engagement are part of the implementation process or a byproduct or output of the implementation of the standard. There are business management benefits, such as meeting stakeholder requirements, improvements to public image related to obtaining a certification such as this and being able to advertise as such, achieving strategic objectives that the organization may have, and it's also able to be integrated with other business management systems that are compatible with the standard. Health and safety standards can also drive improvements in supplier health and safety performance through the implementation of outsourcing requirements and controls. Maintaining a certification that your competition may not have can also provide a competitive advantage depending on your industry. By creating a safer work environment and improving the health and safety performance, you're also minimizing the risk of production delays by identifying where those risks exist and addressing them with operational controls to prevent any injuries or breakdowns or things that would have an impact on production. And besides minimizing production delays, there can be other financial benefits. And depending on the industry and the insurance carrier, sometimes there can even be discounts associated with insurance premiums related to having a health and safety certification. Specific to ISO 45001, obviously with a health and safety standard, we're looking at a commitment to occupational health and safety and the prevention of injuries and ill health. This reduces risks and hazards for employees, contractors, visitors, nearby community members, all that good stuff. We already talked about some of the business management drivers, including the improvement of public image, and following the standard provides a framework for meeting customer and regulatory requirements that the organization may be subject to. As I mentioned, ISO 45001-2018 replaces OSAS 18001-2007. It defines the requirements for an occupational health and safety management system, which needs to be established, implemented, and maintained for the purposes of maintaining certification. It's a framework that allows an organization to control its hazards, reduce the risks of accidents, injuries, ill health, and/or downtime, and continually improve its processes and operations. So that's the standard in a nutshell. That's the intent. It was published in March 2018, and it is a voluntary certification. For clients who will be migrating from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, there is a 3-year transition period. The OSAS 18001-2007 certificates will reflect the expiration date for the end of the transition period or their normal expiration date, whichever occurs first. And we'll talk a little bit more about the transition process in a minute. PGR did issue a transition plan, and I included the link on the screen so you can jot that down, or just so you're aware, the slides and a recording of the webinar will be made available on PGR's website after the fact. Once the presentation is over, it'll be available in the next couple of days. Since the standard was published March 2018 and there's a 3-year transition period, you'll see the deadline relating to March 2021. And I do have a timeline on the next slide we'll take a closer look at. Through this transition plan, PGR has communicated a deadline by which transition or migration audits must occur. And this is in order to avoid a lapse in certification. What that means is we have accounted for the time it takes to obtain corrective actions from the client and perform our internal certification review and decision-making activities as a certification body in order to be able to issue that new certificate before the old one expires. So if you do not heed the deadline, you could have a lapse in certification. We don't guarantee the new certificate would be issued before your old certificate expires if you do not adhere to the audit deadlines. Transitions or migrations can occur during either a surveillance or a recertification audit based on your cycle and your preference as the client. However, please note that a minimum of 1 audit day will be added for the verification of transition requirements. So as I mentioned, we have a transition timeline on this slide, and we've been hosting the webinar quarterly. You can view past recordings if that's of interest to you, but the timeline here reflects the publication of the standard, the audit dates that we have agreed upon and communicated as part of our transition plan, and the ultimate deadlines for conducting audits and obtaining new certifications. So depending on whether you are being certified for the first time, you are going to want to look at certain dates, versus if you are a client who's already certified to OSAS 18001 and will be migrating to the new standard, you'll be looking at other dates. So if you are pursuing certification for the first time and you would still like to be certified to OSAS 18001 first, maybe you've already gotten your paperwork underway to the old standard and you're not ready to revise everything to the new standard, you have until the end of this year to have your audit conducted. After the end of this year, we will only be conducting new registration audits to the new standard. So keep that deadline in mind. For existing OSAS 18001 clients, your final OSAS 18001 audit will have to take place prior to June 1st of next year. After that, all audits will be done to the new standard. So you'll need to transition after that date, depending on your audit cycle. If you want one more audit to the old standard, make sure it's scheduled before this. And then you will have to transition by December 1st of 2020 to avoid a lapse in certification. This is what we talked about a couple minutes ago. For us to be able to guarantee no lapse in certification, your audit has to take place by this date. If you have another audit to OSAS 18001, you'll have to have another audit within that same calendar year. So keep that in mind as well as you're planning your audits. All certificates must be transitioned by this date, March 12th, 2021, reflecting the 3-year transition period. All OSAS 18001 2007 certificates will be obsolete as of this date. So if your new ISO 45001 certificate has not been issued by this date, you will have a lapse in certification. That is the deadline to transition. And when we're talking about transition, we're talking about current certified clients migrating to this new standard. Obviously, at any point, if you're a new client, you can get certified to ISO 45001. Okay. So we'll discuss the main changes to the standard. At a high level, one of the primary changes was the adoption of the Annex SL structure to stay compatible, to reflect the format of ISO 9001 2015, ISO 14001 2015, the other ISO standards that were revised to adopt this structure. So they all follow the same format, the same clause titles, and this is what that looks like. Makes it easier to integrate the standards and keep everything the same. The revision also includes some changes to the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. That can be found within the standard. So as I mentioned, key changes in ISO 45001 include the adoption of the ISO structure, which is the Annex SL we just looked at. In ISO 45001, there is an emphasis on leadership, which also aligns with the changes to ISO 14001 2015, if any of you are familiar with that standard as well. There's a focus on risk management, greater emphasis on objectives, measurement, and change, changes to the communication and awareness requirements, and fewer prescriptive requirements, giving clients more flexibility in how they want to implement the various requirements. So those are the changes at a high level, and we'll be looking at the changes in more detail with the remainder of the presentation. There are changes to some terms that I've highlighted here. Again, you can access the slides after the presentation to review these in more detail. They're also found within the standard. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to go through these. They are available on the slides to highlight the changes in terminology. Some are changed terms, they've been replaced. Other times the definition itself has changed. The intended outcomes of the occupational health and safety management system is worth noting because this is a way to measure the effectiveness of the system, whether or not the intended outcomes of the system are being met. So just to highlight, the intended outcomes of the OHSMS are to prevent injury and ill health to workers and to provide a safe and healthy workplace. So you'll see this intended outcome term again. Top management is important. Again, I mentioned there's an emphasis on leadership, addressing risks. We have documented information, a term that's replaced documents and records in the various standards. And the audit term. Changes to ISO 45001 include strategic occupational health and safety management. There's an increased prominence in management's role within the standard, as well as the alignment with the organization's strategic planning. Leadership is responsible for ensuring the success of the system, and a new clause has been added to the standard to reflect the importance of leadership, their roles, their responsibility to promote the health and safety management aspects within the organization. So there's less emphasis on health and safety management representatives and really putting the responsibility on the leadership team. Okay, someone put their hand up. Sorry, I was just trying to get that notification to go down. So like I said, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them into the questions section, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Proactivity is emphasized throughout the presentation because of the emphasis on risk management. So instead of reacting to things that have already occurred, we're taking the expectation of the standard is that the organization will take a proactive approach, committing to proactive initiatives, identifying the risks to health and safety of their workers and interested parties, to include hazard identification, risk assessment processes, emergency response, operational controls, monitoring and measurement, a variety of requirements within the standard. So taking a more proactive approach is an important concept in the new standard. You will see that again several times throughout this presentation. I also mentioned that the performance of the system is important. So the occupational health and safety performance in regards to continual improvement is a shift from the OSAS 18001. The emphasis is more on improving the performance of the system, the health and safety performance, rather than an emphasis on improving the system itself. And that's one key difference between the two standards. Communication requirements changed, as I mentioned earlier as well. So there is equal emphasis on external as well as internal communications in the revised standard. I already mentioned the replacement of the documented information term, replacing documents and records, and this aligns with the other standards that have been revised to reflect this format as well. The documented information really gives clients more flexibility in determining the formats or media that make the most sense for their organization in terms of meeting the requirements of the standard. It no longer requires as many of the documented procedures necessarily if there are other formats or methodologies that make sense for your organization. Looking closer at the individual clauses, Clause 4 reflects the context of the organization determining internal and external issues relevant to the management system and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So like I said, we'll be seeing that phrase a couple times. So the context is relevant to the management system's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. If something can have an impact on that, it's relevant to the context. Same goes for interested parties, not just employees, and what the needs and expectations of those interested parties may be. And those needs and expectations can translate to requirements of the system. When determining the scope, you're going to need to consider the issues and the needs and expectations discussed above. Clause 5 focuses on leadership. Top management is ultimately accountable for the management system, its effectiveness. They're responsible for integrating the management system in other business processes, ensuring adequacy of resources allocated to the management system and to the health and safety processes, communicating the importance of the management system as well as conformance to the management system requirements. Requirements within the standard can be delegated by top management, but in the end, top management is ultimately accountable for whether or not they are effective. No significant changes to the policy requirements, except that, again, we're looking at the system's ability to achieve its intended outcomes, and the policy terminology should now include a commitment to participation as well as the previously required verbiage. As I mentioned, a management representative is no longer required by the standard. It's not even mentioned in the standard anymore. So top management is welcome to delegate the responsibilities and requirements in the standard as they see fit, but are ultimately accountable for the system themselves. Participation and consultation is still part of the standard, and it's actually more specific or prescriptive in the new version. So take a close look at how those requirements have changed and what is now required to meet that particular section. Clause 6 covers planning requirements. This entire section of the standard has been restructured. Planning and risk determination need to be taken into consideration, both positive and negative. So this represents risks and opportunities respectively. Any identified issues, as well as the needs and expectations of interested parties. All of those need to be taken into consideration at the planning phase, with a focus on achieving the intended outcomes. We discussed that earlier, the intended outcomes being preventing injury and preventing injury and ill health and providing a safe workplace. These requirements are not very different from what we've already discussed. Any actions needed to address the risks and opportunities identified per the slide beforehand, achieving its intended outcomes, preventing or minimizing any undesired effects such as injuries and ill health, as well as continually improving the performance of the system. Risks and opportunities may be related to hazards, legal and other requirements, risks and opportunities that can affect the intended outcomes, and any other relevant sources. Hazard identification sections of the standard require proactive approaches, as we already discussed, and this section is a bit more prescriptive now as well, to be considered through the hazard identification process, such as people in the nearby area who can be affected by the organization, people present at the workplace who are not controlled by the organization. Sometimes, for example, we see situations with temporary employees that fall into this category. Sometimes they are controlled by the organization. Other times the temp agency maintains control of those employees or those workers. But it is still important to include them in this requirement within the standard. So it's not an exemption or an exclusion that can be claimed just because the temp agency retains control over those employees. They would still be relevant. The work area itself and equipment designs can be relevant. Changes being proposed to the management system can be relevant. Past incidents can be relevant. Those are just a couple examples of items that need to be considered in the hazard identification process. Both risks and opportunities need to be considered, and there are separate subclauses related to that. You have to have a process in place to assess those risks and opportunities. Documented information is required to be maintained as evidence of meeting this requirement. So while the documented information definition has been expanded and clients have more flexibility in how they want to do those things, they don't necessarily have to have a documented procedure, but they do have to have a process, and they do have to have documented information as evidence. So the outputs of the process have to be clear, showing that you have this process in place. If it's not a documented procedure, what is that process? And having documented information as evidence of the implementation of a process, if that makes sense. Legal and other requirements are still required to be identified and maintained up to date. How these requirements apply to the organization and its hazards and risks is also very important. This is not just a list of the regulations, but actually having determined how they apply. If there are any relevant communication requirements relevant to those requirements, that should also be determined. Legal and other requirements can result in risks and opportunities. That's worth mentioning as well. Risks and opportunities, legal and other requirements, emergency situations, and other topics such as that have to be addressed, must address the actions related to the management system. So I think I said that backwards, but the action planned for the management system needs to address all of these topics, potentially more, depending on your organization and the requirements that you're subject to. As a reminder, for those of you who are familiar with the OSAS 18001 standard and the related OSHA requirements, there is a hierarchy of controls that has not changed from the previous standard, and the requirement to adhere to that is still found in ISO 45001. So the actual hierarchy of controls can be found in clause 8.1.2, so we'll get to that as well. Objectives are still required to improve the management system and the performance of the management system. The requirements here haven't changed much, if at all. Not only do the objectives need to be identified, but you also have to plan how they'll be achieved, any resource needs, how it will be monitored, things like that. Clause 7 focuses on support. The competency and awareness requirements have been separated into separate subclauses, and awareness criteria are more prescriptive in the new ISO 45001 standard. Commitments to health and safety protection are to be given more consideration related to communication requirements. And any external reporting requirements must be controlled. We already introduced the changed terminology for documented information. And again, that is to incorporate additional forms of media that may be utilized by an organization. So taking a closer look at clause 7, competency requirements must be determined by the organization for workers that can affect the performance of the management system. We also need evidence of competency through documented information. So go back and look at that definition to see what your options are there. If there is a gap between the competency of an employee or worker and the competency requirements for his or her role, action must be taken to close that gap and to meet the competency requirements. We're going to be looking for documented information as evidence of those actions and evaluation of the effectiveness of the actions taken. For example, if training was provided to obtain the competency requirements, was training effective and how was that evaluated? The awareness section identifies several specific items that relevant workers must be made aware of. That's the organization's responsibility. And this includes the actual or potential ramifications of not following the management system requirements. This is pretty important for workers to be aware of. Again, the communication section has been broken down to include both internal and external communication requirements. No significant changes to the internal communication requirements. External communication requirements need to be determined by the management system or within the management system. What's required to be communicated, how it will be communicated, to whom, when, all that good stuff. And this is also an area where external interested party requirements may come into play or dictate some of these requirements. 7.5 reflects the requirements to control documented information, similar to document and record control requirements in the previous OSAS 18001 standard. Clause 8 covers operational planning and controls. At a high level, actions must be established within the relevant processes to control the hazards and risks that we have been discussing up to this point, with documented information maintained as evidence of an effective process having been implemented. This is where you'll find the hierarchy of controls, and again, to reiterate, there were no significant changes to the hierarchy itself. There is a clause 8.1.3 which reflects management of change requirements. This was always implied in the old standard, but now has really definitive language of its own, requiring a process to control the planning of changes that could affect the OHS performance of the organization. So this provides a proactive opportunity to discuss and plan any changes the organization is planning for, to, again, proactively evaluate the risks that those changes may introduce to the management system and be able to plan accordingly, implement controls as necessary, change the plan itself to avoid some of those risks if possible. Like I said, mitigating any negative impacts of those changes instead of taking a reactive approach and dealing with any negative impacts resulting from a change that was not planned for or didn't go through this management of change process. Some examples include new products, new services, new processes, new equipment, changing working conditions, changes to existing equipment, changes to legal and other requirements, things like that. That is definitely not an all-inclusive list, but just to get the ball rolling with a couple examples. The procurement process requirements are in place to ensure procurement processes are controlled and that the organization maintains control over any outsourced processes. Again, as far as they are able to affect the management system and its performance, its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. Just because something is outsourced by an organization doesn't mean it can't have an impact on the management system or its intended outcomes. Similarly, any contractors utilized would need to be controlled as well, identifying and controlling any risks related to the activities the contractors are performing. This includes activities the contractors are performing themselves, as well as any impact on the contractors themselves that may be presented by your organization, the work that the employees are doing on site, all that good stuff. It also requires that there be criteria for contractor selection identified within the management system, and for the organization to have processes in place to ensure that the contractor activities meet the requirements of the management system. So again, just because the work is outsourced or a contractor is utilized doesn't mean that the requirements of the management system are not still very relevant. And those requirements are summarized in the outsourcing field clause here. There aren't significant changes to the emergency preparedness and response requirements in the standard, but there are some additions or additional items to be considered when developing the emergency response processes or plans. So take a look at that section as well, see what needs to be considered when you're developing your emergency plans. Clause 9 relates to performance evaluation, monitoring, and measurement. The organization needs to determine the management system's monitoring and measurement requirements and how they will be implemented. And again, that's relevant to the management system's performance and effectiveness. No significant changes to the internal audit requirements, although it does more prescriptively specify criteria of the audit program and a requirement to report to the relevant managers, workers, and other interested parties the results of the internal audit. So that language was not as strong in the previous standard. There are some additions or revisions to the inputs and outputs required for the management review. So take a look at that section as well for changes, and keep in mind, again, the increased emphasis on top management's role in the standard. Clause 10 covers the improvement requirements in this new structure. So the identification of opportunities for improvement is required, although the terminology may be changed. Incident, nonconformity, and corrective action requirements are addressed in 10.2. Timely actions are required. So this has to do as well with the proactive emphasis, the top management and leadership responsibility emphasis. You must react in a timely manner to any incidents or nonconformities that occur that demonstrates the importance of the system from the management team, not just sitting on those requirements for a while or letting them slip through the cracks. If there's an injury, if there's an incident, even if it's a near miss, findings from audits, nonconformities from a variety of sources, timely response to those types of incidents and addressing them, evaluating where else those risks may exist, and taking action to implement controls or conduct an investigation. Those are really important. Corrective actions should be reviewed for effectiveness. And again, you're going to need evidence in the form of documented information as evidence that these processes are in place and being maintained. The results of these types of investigations or the outcomes of the investigations must also be reported to relevant workers or their representatives and any relevant interested parties as well. .3 at a high level just is requiring continual improvement of the management system through a variety of pathways, including participation of workers, communication of results to relevant individuals, and evidence of any actions or improvements taken through in the form of documented information. ISO 45001 also has Annex A, which provides guidance on the use of the document, and a bibliography. We're not going to take a look at those, but they are found at the back of the standard if you would like to take a closer look at those on your own. So before we close out the changes related to the standard and look closer at the transition process and the certification process at the end, and any questions, I just want to mention a couple things. Certain IAF documents were also revised and released in conjunction with the ISO 45001 standard, or the timing was congruent because they are related or have an impact on the implementation of these standards. So primarily these documents are relevant to the certification body, such as PJR, but there are some changes which flow down to our client organizations. So I want to make you guys aware of those changes, highlight what would be relevant for you, and draw your attention to those changes here. So these documents, for one, require notification to your certification body of any significant changes as soon as possible. So what this means is if you've moved or you're planning to move, if you have a change in who the management representative would be, or the employee count, or something like that, anything that would constitute a significant change, and I do believe that that's defined in one of the documents, it can't wait until your next audit to be brought to the attention of the auditor, during the opening meeting or during the audit itself. We now are required to be notified in writing as soon as possible by the client. So if you are a client of PJR's, this would be a requirement to notify our program management in writing as soon as possible once a significant change has been occurred. Ideally, you could let us know even beforehand, but again, the main takeaway of this is that it can't wait until the next audit to be communicated. There is a prescribed audit timetable within these documents used to calculate audit time based on risk level and employee count, and there are some changes to those tables. So there may be an impact on audit time, and I want to emphasize that this is prescribed by these IAF mandatory documents. This is not something that PJR creates on their own. With the emphasis in the standard on top management and their accountability, if top management does not attend the closing meeting of the audit that PJR conducts to ISO 45001, we'll be looking to understand why they are absent. A reasonable excuse for their absence should be provided and will be documented by the auditor to assess their role and the effectiveness of the leadership role in relation to meeting the requirements of the standard that we discussed today. Certification bodies may conduct special audits in response to compliance issues or incidents, and may even be forced to suspend or withdraw certification accordingly. This is spelled out in the terms and conditions in PJR's contract, but I just want to highlight for anyone who's not aware, we are allowed to conduct these audits as necessary, in addition to your regularly scheduled surveillance and certification audits. Legal compliance violations or gaps may also prevent or impede initial certification. So if you're pursuing certification for the first time and such violations come to light, that may impede the certification process. We'll be looking for objective evidence of the organization's capability to overcome those gaps and prevent future violations of that nature. Overall, the takeaway of these documents and the ISO 45001 standard itself is that the performance expectations for the management system, and thus the organization, have really been raised. The bar has been raised across the board. So keep that in mind as you're getting ready to migrate to the new standard, or you're implementing the standard for the first time. These two documents, in conjunction with ISO 45001, really raise the bar. Okay, So to wrap up today's presentation, for any clients who are pursuing certification for the first time or considering adding this certification, the certification process looks like this. The first step would be for your organization to establish the required documentation, to conduct any training to the health and safety management system and the requirements implemented from the standard. And then you would be implementing the requirements themselves found in the standard and the documentation framework that was established in the first bullet point. And that includes conducting your first internal audit, a compliance evaluation, and a management review, a review of the system, which would take place after the internal and compliance audits to be able to include those outcomes in the system review. You would also need to contract with a certification body such as PJR to be able to conduct those audits. And those initial certification audits would be conducted in the form of a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit, so 2 separate audits. And any nonconformities identified during the stage 2 audit, we'll talk more about those audits on the next slide, but just as an important takeaway, any nonconformities need to be addressed prior to the issuance of a certificate. So specifically, the registration process consists of 2 audits, as I mentioned, the stage 1 and stage 2. The stage 1 audit is a documentation review of the management system to evaluate the readiness of the organization to move on to stage 2. Does the documentation framework meet the requirements of the standard? That's what we focus on there. And there are no nonconformities issued at a stage 1, but you may have concerns that you want to focus on prior to your stage 2 audit to hopefully avoid nonconformities during that audit. The stage 2 audit, on the other hand, is an audit of the entire management system. This would definitely be on site. It would include interviews of employees, observations of the work that's going on and the work environment itself, sampling of the processes to test the effectiveness of the system, to assess whether or not it's meeting the requirements of the standard, whether it's been implemented effectively. This audit, the stage 2 audit, as well as any audits after the stage 1, could potentially result in nonconformities, which would need to be addressed by the organization through the corrective action process and resolved before a certificate could be issued. Once a certificate is issued and certification is obtained, you are on a 3-year surveillance cycle. So you've got your certification audit, then 2 years of surveillance audits, which could be annual or semi-annual depending on your contract. And those are partial system audits. It would be a sampling of some of the processes, unlike the stage 2 audit, which was a sampling of all of the processes. In that 3rd year of the cycle, we have a recertification audit, which is really identical to a stage 2 audit in that it's an on-site audit of all of the processes and results in the issuance of a certificate once any nonconformities are addressed. And then the 3-year cycle starts over again with surveillance audits after that. Excuse me. Just worth noting for health and safety audits, multi-site certifications are sometimes relevant if you have one headquarters location with multiple other locations doing the same exact activity. They can be certified together, potentially under a multi-site scheme, and there are pros and cons to this approach compared to just having each site individually certified. The pros would include having one corporate certificate with the other sites listed within an appendix, the opportunity to sample some of the sites within the multi-site scheme instead of having each one audited necessarily every year, and reductions in audit time associated with this sampling. One of the main cons of this scheme would be if any of the sites lose their certificate, the whole certificate would be in jeopardy as they would all be certified under one certificate. So it's something to keep in mind if that is relevant to your organization, and we can certainly chat more about that in detail with your salesperson or the schedulers as we look to if you're looking to pursue certification for the first time. Similarly, as I mentioned, ISO 45001 can be integrated with other standards. So if you already have certifications to other standards and you're looking to integrate, or when you are looking to become certified to ISO 45001, if you are also interested in being certified to other standards such as ISO 9001 or ISO 14001, R2, the responsible recycling of electronics standard, is one that is commonly integrated with an environmental and a health and safety standard such as this. You can receive discounts for integrated systems and integrated audits. This requires that the management system itself be integrated, one manual, one internal audit, one management review, things like that, where you're treating the system as a whole and not separated by standard necessarily. There are audit time discounts available for integration. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so that was the last slide of content. If you have any questions and you haven't already typed them in, please do so now. I'm going to take a look at the questions that we do have with our time remaining, and I'm going to leave the final slide up with our contact information. Oops, I have to update this slide, I apologize. So we have a new program manager for the EHS department. Her name is Stacy DeSantis. I have her email address here. I just have to update the slide itself. I'll do that after today's presentation. Again, my name is Austin. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager, and I can be contacted as well. So feel free to reach out to Stacy or I with any technical EHS questions. Again, obviously today's presentation was about the health and safety standard, but we cover the EHS program as a whole and can answer questions accordingly. If you are a new client looking to obtain a quote for pursuing certification, I've also listed our sales department contact information here as well. So feel free to utilize that and reach out to PJR for your auditing needs. Let's take a look at any questions that we may have. Okay. So our first question is, how can one perform a safety audit using ISO 45001? I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So obviously ISO 45001 is the health and safety standard, replacing OSAS 18001. If you're talking about an internal audit, you can either do that in-house with qualified employees, or you can outsource that to a qualified entity to perform your internal audits. If you are talking about assessing risk within the facility, my answer would be about the same. The standard defines who could, what monitoring is required, what that risk assessment looks like, and there are other standard documents that you could reference, probably found in the footnotes or the bibliography or the annex. Annex A may be helpful in addressing your specific auditing questions, or you can use my email address to send me an email and we can look at those in more detail. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I'd be glad to talk more about that offline since I'm not fully clear on your question. Okay, so if a client recently signed for an R2 audit, which requires a health and safety standard, would I recommend changing to 45,001 instead of including 18,001? If so, would there be additional time required? So as I mentioned, you want to take a look at that timeline slide to see when you would be ready to be certified. So it's kind of hard to answer that. It depends on how far you've gotten with the documentation, if the client is interested in revising it to the new standard, or if they want to move forward with 18,001 and then migrate by the deadline expressed for 2020. We can talk more, again, we could talk more about this offline. If the client pursues certification to 18,001 and then eventually migrates to 45,001, the additional time requirement would be at least 1 day added to that migration audit. If it's an initial audit to ISO 45001 right off the bat, time would just be calculated based on those tables in the IAF mandatory documents that we discussed towards the end of the presentation. So that's really a judgment call for the organization to make depending on how far they've gotten in the implementation process. Again, if the documentation is already done, if an internal audit has already been done, all of those things would need to be, the documentation would need to be edited, and the internal audits, things like that would need to be conducted again to the new standard. So it really depends on how far in the process they've gotten to make that decision. Okay, so we have a question that asks, after June 1st of 2020, no surveillance audits of OSAS 18001 are allowed. So I'm going to go back to the slide. We can pull up the transition slide to take a look at that together. Okay, so for clients who are already certified to OSAS 18001, June 1st, 2020 is the deadline for the final audit to that standard. So yes, so after June 1st, 2020, we wouldn't be conducting any audits to the standard, to OSAS 18001. Any audits after June 1st, 2020 have to be to the new standard. So depending on when your audits are normally conducted during the year, like where you fall in your cycle, if you would have an audit, for example, a surveillance audit in July of 2020, and you're not ready to transition in July of 2020, you would want to schedule your audit earlier in 2020 for that year to give yourself a couple more months to transition. Again, keep in mind that if your migration audit does not take place by December 1st of 2020, we cannot guarantee you won't have a lapse in certification. So we've got this March 12th, 2021 deadline for everyone to have transitioned or have a lapse in certification. So working backwards from there, depending on when your surveillance audit or your recertification audit would be due, keep an eye on that June 1st, 2020 deadline. Any new certifications have to be conducted before the end of 2019. And the last question I see up here is to give some examples related to interested party needs and expectations concerning health and safety. So let's see, off the top of my head, and this really varies by industry and organization, certainly OSHA would be an interested party. Certainly they have, their regulations, which are compliance requirements, but they would be an interested party. Their needs and expectations would relate to compliance to those regulations. Interested parties would include employees, contractors, visitors to the facility, any workers present in the facility that are not under the control of the organization, such as temp employees, depending on whether the temp agency maintains control or the client organization maintains control of those employees. If there are other companies that are co-located in that same facility and have employees and equipment of their own, the interaction between the two would be relevant. Employees interfacing with hazards that may be presented by your organization or the other organization, and that overlap as far as noise, chemicals, emergency response, similarly any neighboring people, homes, other companies located in the nearby vicinity, depending on what your organization does. Is there a concern for noise? Is there the potential for chemical releases or air emissions that could have an impact on them? Let's see. Sometimes insurance companies are interested parties if they have specific requirements. Landlords, if you as an organization don't own the building, they may have needs and expectations. Local community emergency response teams may have relevant concerns or requirements, or communication requirements. Unions. I'm sure there are plenty more. Suppliers, vendors. There's a whole host of considerations, and then again, their needs and expectations would vary. Some may have expectations for certain things being communicated to them in a certain way. The landlord probably has requirements for what equipment is to be maintained by the landlord and what is to be maintained by the tenant organization, things like that. That's just a couple examples off the top of my head. Obviously not an all-inclusive list, but hopefully enough to answer your question. Okay, that's it for the questions that I see. If you have any more, go ahead and quickly type those in before we wrap up. Or again, you can contact myself or the program manager for some offline discussion. I'll put that information back up. Oops, sorry about that. Went too fast. Okay, so here's our contact information again. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to close out of this. Thank you so much for your time today and joining us for today's webinar. If you've already been certified to OSAS 18001 and you'll be migrating to ISO 45001, good luck. Keep an eye on future webinars, which we will continue to update as we have more information to share. And if you're pursuing certification for the first time to either standard, best of luck, and thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.